In the summer heat of Santa Monica, a supermodel's body lay decomposing inside a tiny second-floor studio while the woman who had once been photographed as one of America's most recognizable beauties remained unidentified. Margaux Hemingway had been dead for at least 2 days when police finally reached the apartment on July 1, 1996. The heat had already taken its toll on the body. Her remains were so badly decomposed that investigators could not simply look at her and know who they had found. Her face, hands, and exposed skin had turned a dark greenish-black color due to blood rot under the surface. Her face and body were heavily inflated like a balloon from trapped gas inside. Her cheeks, eyelids, and lips were stretched so large that her natural facial structure was gone. It was a grotesquely fitting end to a woman whose entire public life had been built around her face. Margaux's friends had not seen her since the previous Friday, and when nobody could get an answer from her, concern finally turned into a search. They entered through the balcony with help from a worker. Inside was the body of a 41-year-old woman whose death had already begun to become a forensic problem. Welcome to the cursed Hollywood. Margaux Hemingway was the granddaughter of Ernest Hemingway, one of the most famous writers of the 20th century, and the Hemingway name followed her everywhere. By the time Margaux entered adulthood, she was not simply trying to become a model. She was carrying a family legend on her back. And that legend had a dark side. Ernest Hemingway had killed himself in 1961. Margaux would eventually die under circumstances that made people look back at that history with uncomfortable attention. She was found dead on July 1, 1996, just 1 day before the anniversary of her grandfather's suicide. The coincidence was chilling, but it wasn't the thing that made Margaux's story disturbing. She was tall, striking, and unusually photogenic. In the 1970s, that combination turned her into a celebrity in her own right. She appeared in magazines, moved through the worlds of fashion and Hollywood, and became the face of Fabergé's Babe fragrance in a contract reportedly worth $1 million. For a young woman in that era, it was an extraordinary amount of money. But the photographs only showed the part of Margaux that could be photographed. Behind them, her life was becoming increasingly difficult. She struggled with alcohol and an eating disorder and eventually entered the Betty Ford Center for treatment in 1988. She also suffered from epilepsy and depression. The problems did not disappear simply because the public continued to see the same glamorous face. By the time she reached her 40s, the woman who had once seemed almost untouchable was living a much quieter life. She was in depression and anxiety because long before Margaux Hemingway became famous for her face, there was a part of her childhood she would spend years trying to escape. She grew up inside the Hemingway family, but the famous surname did not mean she grew up in a peaceful home. Her parents' marriage was troubled, alcohol was present, and there was anger and instability inside the family. Margaux later described feeling forgotten as a child, as though the people around her were physically there but emotionally somewhere else. And then, years later, she made an accusation. Margaux said that her father, Jack Hemingway, had sexually abused her when she was a child. The allegation was devastating. Her father and stepmother rejected it, and the relationship between Margaux and her father broke down completely. Her stepmother publicly accused Margaux of lying, while the family became increasingly divided over what had happened. Margaux was not the only sister to describe something disturbing. Years after her death, her younger sister Mariel said that both Margaux and their older sister Muffet had been sexually abused by their father. Mariel described memories from childhood that she herself found difficult to speak about decades later. Margaux spent much of her adult life carrying serious psychological pain. Depression became part of that life. So did alcoholism, bulimia, and epilepsy. Her first epileptic seizure had happened when she was only 8, and as she grew older, the problems multiplied rather than disappearing. By the time the world knew her as a supermodel, she was already fighting battles that nobody could see from the other side of a camera. She battled an eating disorder badly enough to enter the Betty Ford Center in 1988. She struggled with alcohol and depression, and she later spoke openly about trying to break away from the destructive patterns that had surrounded her family for years. She once described herself as having been caught in the life of her grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, whose suicide had already become one of the family's defining tragedies. Margaux was only 5 when he killed himself. She would grow up carrying that memory, the family history, the allegations against her father, her own illnesses, and eventually a public life that demanded she remain beautiful even when she was falling apart. The first crack in Margaux Hemingway's perfect image came when Hollywood finally gave her the thing her fame seemed to promise, a starring role. In 1976, at only 22, Margaux appeared in Lipstick, playing a fashion model whose life is destroyed by violence. Her younger sister Mariel was also in the film, and the irony would become painful. The movie was heavily criticized, Margaux's performance was attacked, and the acting career that was supposed to carry her beyond modeling never became what she had hoped. For Margaux, the humiliation was made worse by what happened next. The younger sister who had entered the movie almost as an afterthought began receiving the kind of critical attention Margaux had been expecting for herself. Mariel's career took off. Margaux's did not. The woman who had once been paid $1 million to represent Faberge perfume was suddenly struggling to find another major film role. She continued appearing in smaller productions, but Hollywood never turned her into the actress it had promised she might become. Then her private life began falling apart alongside the career. Margaux had already been drinking heavily, and she later acknowledged that constant dieting and alcohol had taken a serious toll on her. Her eating disorder became severe enough that she sought treatment for bulimia, while epilepsy and depression added another layer to an already unstable life. In 1987, she entered the Betty Ford Center. She was trying to rebuild herself. But recovery did not restore the life she had once had. She tried to force her way back into the spotlight, even appearing nude in Playboy in 1990 in an attempt to prove that she was still physically fit and capable of attracting the attention that had once come so easily. But the major roles never returned. By the 1990s, the distance between her old life and her new one had become enormous. The magazines had moved on. The Hollywood invitations had become fewer. That was the life she was living when she eventually disappeared into that small Santa Monica apartment. And for several days, nobody knew she was dead. Just 2 days before her body was found, Margaux Hemingway was still walking through Santa Monica as if nothing terrible was about to happen. On Saturday evening, a neighbor saw her walking down Main Street. She looked haggard and disturbed, and the neighbor remembered her as a sad figure. Margaux had spent years announcing comebacks that never quite became the comeback she wanted. This time, though, there were actual projects in motion. She had completed months of work hosting a nature television series, and she was discussing a new perfume, a clothing line and other business ideas. Friends said she was still determined to rebuild her career. Only days before her death, she had even been seen at a farmer's market buying produce. And one of her closest friends, Judy Stabill, had dinner with her the previous week and said Margaux was in fine spirits. On Thursday night, Margaux appeared at a West Hollywood restaurant and sang on stage with a friend. Stabill remembered her that night as radiant, dressed entirely in white. Then the calls stopped. Margaux had appointments arranged for the final weekend of June, but she postponed them. By Monday, Stabill could no longer reach her. She couldn't even get Margaux's answering machine. That was when the worry became serious. A friend and a workman went to the apartment. The door was locked. One of them climbed a ladder and looked through a glass door from the balcony. And there she was. Margaux Hemingway was dead. She had apparently been lying inside the apartment since Friday or Saturday, alone and undiscovered while the California heat continued to rise around her. When authorities arrived, there was no obvious trauma and no sign of forced entry or foul play. There was no suicide note either. At first, police could not even say whether she had taken her own life. The case became a mystery. The decomposition was already so advanced that investigators had to use dental records to establish that the woman inside the apartment was Margaux Hemingway. The face that had once sold perfume for $1 million could no longer identify its owner. The body had been found on July 1st, but the autopsy had not revealed an obvious cause. Then the toxicology results came back. Margaux had taken phenobarbital, a powerful barbiturate, in an amount estimated at roughly twice the lethal level. The coroner's office said the dose was about 10 times what would normally be present from a prescribed amount. So much of the drug was still inside her that the equivalent of about 2 pills had remained undissolved in her stomach when she died. The decomposition created another grim complication. By the time toxicologists examined her remains, they could not obtain a usable blood sample. Instead, they had to test tissue from her brain, kidney and liver to determine how much phenobarbital had entered her system. That evidence changed the case completely. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled that Margaux Hemingway had died from an acute phenobarbital overdose and classified the death as suicide. But the investigation uncovered something even more unsettling. In the days before her death, Margaux had reportedly been asking friends where she could obtain phenobarbital. She told them she needed it for a trip to Germany, where she was supposed to film a television program. She had a prescription for clonazepam for her epilepsy, but investigators found no prescription for the phenobarbital. Inside the apartment, authorities found 3 bottles of clonazepam. 2 were empty. Another was partially filled. They also found an empty phenobarbital bottle labeled for 100 tablets. Because her blood could not be tested, investigators could not determine exactly how many pills she had swallowed. And then came the detail that made the final days of her life even harder to understand. Margaux had been talking to people about the afterlife. She never directly told anyone, "I want to kill myself." But she had discussed what might exist on the other side. Friends remembered those conversations and had encouraged her to stay alive and work through her problems. Yet only days later, she was dead. She had battled depression and alcoholism, so suicide was an obvious possibility. But there were other explanations. She had epilepsy and had taken medication for years, and some people close to her wondered whether a seizure or another medical problem could have killed her. Years later, her sister Mariel recalled what the coroner had told her about the scene. Margaux had been lying on her back with a pillow beneath her legs and a book resting on her lap. Mariel said the coroner herself had initially told her that the scene did not look like that of someone who had committed suicide. That belief would not survive the toxicology results. But before those results arrived, Margaux's death remained suspended between possibilities. By the time Margaux was found, the apartment had been holding her body for days. The precise time of death could not be established immediately. Investigators estimated that she had probably been dead since late June 28 or early June 29, meaning her body had remained inside the apartment through the hot Southern California weather before anyone discovered her. The temperature was around 90 degrees. And the heat had already changed the body so severely that ordinary identification was no longer reliable. 5 days after her body was discovered, Margaux was laid to rest in Ketchum, Idaho, the place she had always regarded as home. Her ashes were buried near her grandfather's grave, surrounded by the mountains and trails of the valley where she had grown up. About 100 friends and neighbors attended the service. It was a quiet ending for someone whose early adult life had been anything but quiet. Just a cemetery in Idaho and the people who had known her before she became Margaux Hemingway. Her ashes were placed near the man whose name had helped make her famous and whose death had haunted the family for decades. And the coincidence of the dates made the burial feel almost unbearably symbolic. The granddaughter had returned to the same ground where the Hemingway family story had already claimed another life. Years later, Margaux would speak openly about the family's history of addiction, mental illness, abuse, and suicide. But Margaux herself was no longer there to explain what happened inside that apartment. That is what makes the final mystery impossible to completely resolve. The toxicology can tell us what killed her. It cannot tell us what she was thinking during those final hours. It cannot tell us what she felt when she swallowed the pills. And it cannot tell us whether she believed she was ending her life, escaping something, or simply making a decision she would never have the chance to reconsider.